Okay, so I'll start with what we're going to talk about today. So broadly, I'll have three topics. First, genes, family history, and lifestyle. Then I'll tell you a bit about my dietary six rules and about visceral fat. And then finally, the science behind blood sugar and visceral fat. All right, so we'll start the first part. And that is usually when my
Dr. Chong, would you
patients,
like to put on your slides?
oh, sorry,
Okay.
hang on. Let me just get this sorted out. Okay, right. Okay, can everyone see my slides?
Yes, thank you.
Great. Okay, so I was saying just now that I will start with a three parts to my talk: genes and family history and lifestyle. And then I'll tell you about my dietary six rules and visceral fat, the relationship to visceral fat, and then the science behind blood sugar and visceral fat. So usually when my patients come into the practice, they'll ask me, oh, I have a family history of these illnesses. So what do I do? So commonly heart attack, stroke, hypertension, diabetes, and of course, cancer. Now, we'll first start talking about heart attack because that's the one that all of us are so frightened of and we hear horror stories. So there was a small little town in Massachusetts called Framingham in 1948, and they studied about 30,000 people there. And they are still studying them up to today. It's third generations of study participants. And they found from there that there were all these risk factors. So men are more prone to heart attack, women not so prone. And you're protected, the women are protected because of their hormones. And you have a hypertension, diabetes, smoking, high cholesterol, obesity, gout, and of course, family history. So these eight risk factors were discovered in 1948, but stress was not discovered in 1948. So actually, stress is number nine. And I'll tell you a little bit more about stress and all these other eight risk factors. So inside all our blood vessels, there's a lining called the endothelium. And this lining, we used to think it was a lining, but we now know that there's a lot of activity going on at the lining. So it's actually the biggest organ in our body. It's something like estimated to be about 4 to 7 square kilometers in our body. So it's really, really huge once you open up all the lining. And all these risk factors, the eight, nine risk factors, all attack the lining, resulting in inflammation. And then, of course, the inflammation gives you blockages. So why family history? I mean, the other things, the other nine risk factors, the other eight risk factors rather, they all attack the lining. So for example, if you smoke, the tar attacks the lining, the blood pressure attacks the lining, and the diabetes, sugar attacks the lining, and so on. Now, why family history then? Well, there are people that really kind of abuse themselves and never look after themselves, and nothing happens to them. They live a charmed life. They don't take care of their health, but nothing happens. So we believe that these people have a very, very powerful lining. All the risk factors just attack it and then bounce off. So they've got like a very, very, very potent lining. And we worry when we have a family history of heart attack that we inherit a not so good lining or a defective lining. So that's the thinking behind family history. Then diabetes. Now, diabetes is a huge problem in Singapore now because something like 10 to 11% of the population are diabetic. And over the last 2 years, things have gotten even worse because of the pandemic. And I'm sure you saw this in the papers. So diabetic risk, it's something to the order, if you look at 10 to 11% of the population, then if you're 30 years old, it's 1 in 5 diabetic. All right. And if you're 60 years old, it's 1 in 3. So the numbers are quite staggering. And that's why some years ago, we declared a war on diabetes. And if you look at family history, 2.7 times higher risk than if you didn't have a family history. If both parents were diabetic, my word, it's 5 times more. And if you had a parent who had diabetes when they were younger than 50, the odds are just staggering. Look at that, 4.7 times. And if your mom was diabetic when she was below 50, it's 6 times. If your brothers or sisters are diabetic, it's like 3 times. So these are some pretty powerful genetic factors. Cancer. Now, cancer, the top cancers in Singapore now. For women, it's breast. For men, it used to be lung because of smoking, but now colon has overtaken lung. So colon for men, lung number 2 for men. For women, breast, and then number 2 is colon. For men, number 3 is prostate. So all these top so-called occurring cancers in Singapore, what are the risk factors? And you can see from the slide: obesity, inactivity, alcohol, smoking, pollution, and of course, animal fat. We're talking about red meat. So what's common to a lot of these cancers is obesity and inactivity. And we'll come back to that shortly. Breast cancer, if your mom, your sister, or your mom's sister, the auntie, has breast cancer, then it increases so much more. If you had the breast cancer genes, which is what we believe the situation is, these breast cancer genes are called BRCA1 and 2, then it's about 2.5 times more. And for prostate cancer, brother or father with a prostate cancer, of course, increases the risk. Now, what I tell my patients in the clinic is, why this family history thing? Again, it's the hole in the radar. What do I mean? Well, you see, your immune system is actually pretty effective. I'm sure by now with COVID, you've heard of antibodies and you heard of T cells. So there are 2 arms to the immune system. So on one arm, you have the antibodies. On the other arm, you have the T cells. So what happens is that the radar is always on. The T cells are always looking for cancer cells. And every day, cancer cells do occur in our body because of pollution, carcinogens, smoking, and so on. All kinds of factors can trigger a cancer cell. But your immune system is actually pretty efficient. It will pick up this cancer cell and snuff it out. But what we believe is that when a cancer occurs, there's a hole in the radar and one cell slips through. And so one cell becomes 2, becomes 4, becomes 8, becomes 16. And pretty much when a tumor is present, it's billions of cells. But for some reason, the immune system cannot see the cancer cells. And therefore, what we believe is that there's a hole in the radar. And what we're very worried with family history is that one inherits this hole in the radar. Now, if you inherit a hole, then what do you do? Well, I'll come to that later on, what we can do to prevent. I mean, even if we are dealt a not so good hand of cards, then there's still things we can do to overcome this. So reality is genes and lifestyle. So I would say maybe lifestyle is about 30% and lifestyle is about 70% and genetics is about 30%. And they do affect each other. So there's a lot of studies that show that, people have different responses to blood sugar, for example, or inactivity and so on. And everybody, behaves a bit differently because of the genes. And some of us, of course, even though we have a very good lifestyle, we do not have the outcomes that we want. So some of the very important lifestyle factors would be, for example, sleep. If one doesn't have enough sleep, then what happens? Then it's depression, anxiety, dysthymia. Dysthymia is kind of like a very slow kind of depression that creeps up on the patient and he or she is not even aware of it. Health problems, of course, when you don't have enough sleep. And of course, we tend to eat more when we are deprived of sleep. Diet, if our diet's not so good, then what happens? Obesity, you form visceral fat, and I'll come to that in a little while. And of course, this leads to all kinds of chronic diseases, and the chronic diseases lead to heart attack and strokes, and even cancer. Exercise. Now, what happens if we are inactive? So, of course, we gain weight, We have mobility issues. We're heavy. Our joints are hurting. And then, of course, we lose muscle mass if we're inactive. And you'd be surprised when you're about 40 onwards, you actually lose about half a kilo or a pound of muscle every year. Yes, that's right. You'll be quite amazed. So a lot of my patients, I will tell them, look, when you get older, especially above 40, you have to think about building some muscle. And of course, it's quite difficult, for example, for women to go to the gym to build muscle. So I usually suggest that they do things like yoga, Pilates, or dancing. All these are very helpful to build muscles. Habits, and of course, habits, smoking, alcohol, and this leads to fatty liver, and even for some patients, cirrhosis. And for smoking, of course, lung cancer and the chronic airway disease that you get when you smoke for many, many years. It's called emphysema or chronic bronchitis. Well, they get very, very breathless, even when they're sitting there and doing nothing. So these are the key areas that we have to worry about in our lifestyle, and it's diet, sleep, exercise, and habits. And of course, all this ties in very well because of awareness, mindfulness. It's very important that awareness and mindfulness helps us to deal and improve these areas in our lifestyle. So really, one of the key things I'm going to talk today a lot about is diet and what we can do to actually help ourselves. So our problem is our local diet is high in carbs and refined sugars and hidden sugars. The carbs have hidden sugars. And our problem is also that we have too much of a choice. When we walk into a hawker center, we have literally too much of a choice. So, for example, if you were in Korea or Japan, all the Koreans and Japanese eat a certain kinds of foods, right? But in Singapore, we just have a huge choice. And every day, in a week, for example, the typical Singaporean will eat different types of cuisines. And so that leads to quite a bit of a problem, as we can see later on. And fat has been demonized since the 60s and 70s. So, we've been told, oh, cut back fat, cut back fat. And for example, especially in countries like United States, where they kept cutting back the fat, but they didn't realize that actually sugar is not so good, So they have actually replaced the fat with the sugar. And as a result, today, 70% of Americans or people in the United States are either obese or overweight. And literally, I'll show you later on, but these high spikes of sugar, when you eat a lot of refined sugars, or when you eat carbs with a lot of hidden sugars, it really, really triggers visceral fat. And unfortunately, unhealthy food in Singapore is kind of less expensive, if you know what I mean. So a lot of people gravitate towards that. Now, I am now going to talk about my dietary 6 rules because we are talking about diet. So it's good to know that there's something called basal metabolic rate, where if you don't do anything and you just lie in bed for 24 hours, you still burn 2,000 calories for men, 1,500 calories for women. Now, if, for example, you eat more than this amount by 500 calories, you end up putting on half a kilo every week. That's right, half a kilo every week. And that's the math behind calorie counting. So I have the first rule, which I like to share with you, and it's the 3 rice dishes of Singapore. And this is nasi lemak, nasi biryani, and chicken rice. We all love these 3 rice dishes. Unfortunately, they're all 1,000 over calorie or close to 1,000 calorie each. And you saw just now that for women, it's 1,500, and for men, it's 2,000. And if you go over the limit, you put on half a kilo every week. So that's the first rule. Rule number 2, noodles. We love our noodles here. So a soup noodle is literally 200 calories. The dry version with the sauce is maybe 400, but a fried noodle is a disaster. It's 1,000 calories. All right. So please stay away from the char kway teows and the mee gorengs and the and the Hokkien mees and so on. And another hidden source of calories that we don't realize is actually gravy. So I'll give you the worst example, which is satay gravy. Now, if you put satay gravy on the bihun, it's 1,000 calorie. And so when I eat the satay, I try not to touch the gravy, although it's obviously the most delicious part of it. And sometimes if you go to some restaurants, you may see some elderly folk request a bowl of soup. And then what they'll actually do is they'll take the piece of meat, wash off the gravy in the soup before they pop it into their mouth. So that's actually getting rid of the gravy. All right. So sauces and gravy and some dressings, of course, like for example, your Thousand Island and so on. Fast food, I need not tell you how terrible fast food is, but a Big Mac, a French fry, and a milkshake is 1,500 calories. And there goes the quota for the day. And a Kentucky 3-piece plate, coleslaw, and potatoes is 1,005. So that's it. That's it. Now, everything in a fast food joint starts with 500 calories. Okay. So try your best not to have fast foods if you can. Drinks. A lot of people don't realize that drinks are also very high in sugar. So you know a Coca-Cola is, a red Coca-Cola can is 150 calories. Coke Zero or Diet Coke is 0 or 1 calorie. So think about it. Infinite number of Coke Zeros is equal to 1 red Coca-Cola can, or 150 cans of Diet Coke is equal to 1 red can of Coca-Cola. So try to stay away. And your coffee and tea, your coffee and tea with condensed milk is about 150 calories. If it's with evaporated milk, we call it kopi C or teh C. It's about half, 70. Kopi O or teh O is about 40 calories. And of course, kopi O kosong and teh O kosong is 0 calorie. So you know what to choose when you go buy your coffee or tea. Fruit juices, a problem. All right. Fruit juices in a carton is a bit of a problem because those are super high in calories. A glass of carton juice can set you back something like 200 to 300 calories. So please be mindful and be careful of those Starbucks frappuccinos and huge lattes. They are also several hundred calories sometimes. A lot of people think fruit is actually, that's rule number 6. A lot of people think fruit is actually healthy, but you got to watch these 6 fruits, all right? They're yellow, so that's your melons, your mango, your banana, and your pineapple. And of course, your grapes, your lychees, and longans. So you have a lot of choices, actually. You have all your berries. The berries are pretty healthy. And then you have peach, apple, orange, pear, guava, kiwi, dragon, papaya, and so on. So there's a lot of choice, and try to stay away from these fruits. Now, fruit juices, as I said just now, if you want to drink fruit juice, best make it yourself. Better to pulp it. Actually, better to eat the whole fruit than to juice it. And nowadays, there are these machines called pulpers where they don't actually decimate the fruit into juice, but they kind of leave a lot of fiber and pulp behind. So those are a little bit better. And you may not be aware, but sometimes if you go outside and you order fruit juice from a stall and they fish the fruit out of a Tupperware of syrup, it's actually sugar syrup that they keep the fruit in. Be very careful. And that's my 6th rule. And so remember, my rule number 1 was talking about nasi lemak and nasi biryani and chicken rice. So white rice is bad enough, but these 3 are actually cooked with chicken oil, ghee, and coconut milk. So white rice is already bad, but when you cook it with ghee, coconut milk, and chicken oil, it's even worse. So a white rice is literally about 2 cans of Coca-Cola. All right. The other bad carbs that you can see in my slide is actually potato and yellow noodles. So I'll give you an example. A 200 grams helping of white rice is about 60 grams of sugar. A 200 grams of potato is about 40 grams of sugar. And a 200 grams of Hokkien noodles or yellow noodles is 146 grams of sugar. So it's amazing how much sugar there is in some of these carbohydrates. Now, what are good carbohydrates? So oats are good. Now, you have to be cooked oats, not instant. Instant is as bad as white rice. Soba, because it's made from buckwheat, is pretty healthy. Udon too. Glass noodle is made from mung bean, so that's pretty healthy. And pasta, if you buy the Italian pasta and it's made from durum wheat, it's pretty good. So these are all the good carbohydrates I encourage everybody to try to eat more of. There is also intermediate carbohydrates. These are not that great. Things like, for example, bihun and kway teow. Now, bihun and kway teow are made from rice, but they aren't as bad as white rice. But I prefer the other group of noodles earlier on. Brown rice and wholemeal bread are better, but still not as good as the other group of carbs that I was talking about just the slide earlier. Now, this is the science behind it. So if you have done blood tests, if you've done a checkup and you see this reading of blood sugar is about 100 milligrams per deciliter or 5.5 millimole if it's metric, I prefer to use the milligrams because it's easier to show you and to let you understand what it means. So 100 milligrams per deciliter is actually 1,000 milligrams per liter. It's about 1 gram, really. And you only have 5 liters of blood. So literally in your bloodstream right now, you have about 5 grams of sugar. A diabetic has 10 grams of sugar versus a non-diabetic. So the difference between a diabetic and a non-diabetic is literally 1 teaspoon of sugar, 5 grams. And when you eat a bowl of 250 grams of white rice, your 75 grams of sugar is entering your bloodstream. And you have to push 70 grams into the cells, leaving 5 behind. If you don't do a good job, your body doesn't do a good job, and you push 65 grams in and you leave 10 behind, I'm sorry, you're diabetic. So that's how tight the body controls blood sugar. And every time we eat a bowl of white rice, we're actually stressing our body. We're making our body work very, very hard to push the sugar into the cells. And you can imagine if you do this over decades, for example, 2 bowls of rice every day for decades, for 10 years, 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, are we surprised that one day the system can't cope and then they can't push all the sugar in? They leave quite a lot behind in the bloodstream and one becomes diabetic. Not surprised at all. And that's why 1 in 5 above 30 years old is diabetic and 1 in 3 above 60 years old is diabetic. So that's kind of what we're dealing with. Now, I just want to show you pictorially what's all about. Remember, I was talking to you about the endothelium? That's the lining of the blood vessel. Now, that's a whole blood vessel. So what happens is that the sugar, when you eat a bowl of white rice, and it's 75 grams of sugar, and it enters the blood immediately. And so the body has to get rid of it. You have to push the sugar into the cells. Now, every cell actually has a cell door. And insulin is actually the key. So the key opens the cell door and the sugar flows into the cell to burn for energy, like petrol into a car. But when one is diabetic, obese, overweight, or pre-diabetic, then the key can't open the door. So this leads to a lot of problems because The cell can't get the energy. The sugar is just next door in the bloodstream. And the cell is very hungry. So the cell tells the brain to eat more. And you have this urge to eat. And you can see this honestly. If you look around you, there are people who are very overweight or obese, or they have poorly controlled diabetes. They just keep eating and eating and eating because their cells are actually hungry. So the sugar is in the wrong place, really. The sugar is in the blood. It should be inside the cell, but it's in the blood. And so the cells are not getting the energy. So the billions of cells in the body are telling the brain to eat more. So of course, this is a terrible state of affairs. Now, what happens is that if you look at this chart, now you see the red curves, the red lines, those are the high sugar levels when we eat a lot of white rice or potato or yellow noodles or white bread. And as a result, because the key can't open the door, the pancreas says, hey, my keys are not working. So the pancreas actually pumps out more keys. And the more keys there are, so if one measures the blood sugar, it's high, but actually the insulin level is also sky high because the keys are not working. So the pancreas pumps out more and more keys. So the high insulin levels is actually, insulin is a bad boy, all right? It actually triggers you to put on fat. And where do you put on fat? Voila, you put it on in the tummy. We call it visceral fat. Do you know that when you see a sausage, right, and the sausage has this transparent skin around it, that's called omentum. It's an apron that covers the intestines in the cattle. We also have it in men. So this omentum covers the intestines, and actually the omentum is where the fat is stored. So the omentum is actually a fat warehouse. So that's the problem. So high sugar levels trigger high insulin, and high insulin triggers visceral fat. And how do you know if you have visceral fat? It's very simple. You just take a tape measure and you measure your circumference of your tummy at the navel, not the waist, at the navel. If it's 90 cm for men or 80 cm for women, I'm sorry, you have visceral fat. And how bad is this visceral fat? Well, the problem with visceral fat is that it actually, this fat in the tummy or visceral fat or belly fat, I always call it an alien organ. You remember the movie Alien? Yes, yes. The creature bursts out of the abdomen. So this alien organ, right, this visceral fat actually generates a lot of bad hormones with nasty names like tumor necrosis factor, adiponectin, cytokines, and so on. And all these hormones trigger heart attack, stroke, and cancer. So the enemy is literally visceral fat. And it's sugar that is sugar spikes that is driving insulin spikes. And the insulin spikes is driving the visceral fat accumulation. So coming back to this diagram, now if you eat good carbs, then you see the green line. The green line there is what happens when you eat good carbs. So for example, when you eat pasta, or when you eat tanghun, or when you eat, other good carbs like soba and udon and cooked oats, rolled oats, then what happens is that you get a nice series of sugar hills instead of sugar spikes. And these sugar hills, this 5 sugar hills a day or 5 small meals a day is actually what all the super athletes and your elite footballers and, like EPL footballers and all that, the David Beckhams of the world, they're all eating this 5 times a day. That's the reason. And as a result of eating 5 times a day with small sugar peaks, or I call them sugar hills as opposed to sugar mountains, then the insulin will come down. And you can see the light blue line. That's the insulin coming down. And when your insulin comes down, your visceral fat melts away. So that's really the key. That's why controlling your sugar intake, hidden sugar and refined sugar, obvious sugar, is very, very critical. So if you look at this chart, to summarize it, it's a bit busy, but you kind of understand. So the carbohydrates and the calories are driving these sugar spikes or sugar mountains. And then as a result, the cells are hungry, the cells doors can't open, so the insulin is not working, the pancreas pumps out more insulin, and the insulin drives the visceral fat. And the visceral fat drives diabetes, hypertension, cholesterols. Yes, it's very interesting. If a patient loses visceral fat, his bad cholesterol LDL actually comes down. Yes, it's very fascinating. It's not entirely just diet, it's also visceral fat. And as a result of these three, the three highs, as the a lot of the locals call it, the diabetes, the hypertension, and the cholesterol, then that drives heart attack, strokes. And the cytokines from the visceral fat, we believe, also drives cancer. So that's really critical why we need to watch our sugar spikes. So if you see this diagram here, so A, B, and C. So patient A, patient B, patient C. If all three actually have the same mean glucose level, right? If you calculate it, they all have the same average glucose level. But look at the patterns. And obviously A is, a series of sugar mountains. C is a lot of fluctuation, low sugar levels, sometimes followed by very high sugar levels. So a lot of fluctuation. And B is what we're all aiming for, a nice little sine wave, that goes up and down regularly. So we want to avoid peaks, we want to avoid troughs, because all these are bad and they drive a lot of disease.